Hi, this is Outlaw Bookseller, Stephen E. Andrews, and welcome back to Reading List Rock. And we continue our look at the Stranglers and their literary and cultural influences. So far, we've mostly done literary influences. The culture will come later in a broader sense. And I'm also going to start doing a series where I critique some of the albums in depth and give you my sort of views about them. And it's be interesting to see if they mesh with your own. So a while ago, I said I was going to do a video about the influence of science fiction writing on the Stranglers, and it was one of the things that immediately stood out once they started to get into what I call the scientific era, which is when they took a sort of step back from the street observations of Rattus Norvegicus and No More Heroes and into a sort of more global view and looking at what was happening in the world and what could be happening in the world across Black and White and The Raven, which I see as a distinct sort of phase in their work and their development, both sonically, lyrically, and in all sorts of other ways as well. And of course, it changed them commercially too. I had one comment, the only one I've had, from somebody in the Stranglers fan community saying, no, I don't like sci-fi. And I thought, well, I don't like sci-fi either. I never use the term sci-fi. I say SF or science fiction. I don't use speculative fiction because I don't think it's an accurate term, and I'll talk about that in another video about that subject. But I thought that was rather strange because there are quite a number of Stranglers songs, particularly in those years, which rely enormously on the influence of SF. The fact that Hugh Cornwell was a big SF reader, he's on the record as liking Philip K. Dick and Harlan Ellison, two of the important 60s and 70s American SF writers, is very significant. And of course, you will have seen my video already about the strange career of Bernard Wolfe, who wrote science fiction, jazz, memoir, ghosting, and also books about politics with Trotsky. So just to talk about that today. The first sort of vaguely science fictional sort of messages which come across in the band's music were in the lyrics. Initially in their first single, Get a Grip on Yourself, there's the memorable rock and roll line, stranger from another planet, welcome to our hole, just strap on your guitar and we'll play some rock and roll. And of course, inside Norvegicus, in the inner sleeve, there's the famous picture that almost seems to reveal the Stranglers' future unfolding. The man in black on the stairs, possibly an extraterrestrial, the Viking spear, all those things that we know about, the symbolism. If you don't know about them, I'll cover them when I talk about Rattus in depth. So that was the sort of first mention. It's got a playful one. Then of course on the album there's Goodbye Toulouse, which was loosely based on some of Nostradamus's predictions about the fall of Toulouse, and Cornwell and Burnell looked at the idea that because there's a nuclear power plant there, that it could possibly melt down and destroy the city. And of course at the end we've got that noise which is supposed to represent apparently the nuclear meltdown. And of course, as that hasn't happened yet, that is kind of a science fiction conceit. So, though of course we saw the meltdown at Chernobyl years later, but in '77 there hadn't really been any major meltdowns apart from maybe the American one, China Syndrome one. And it's quite sort of interesting, really. That was the first thing to come up. But you don't really get anything like that on No More Heroes. The sort of first stirrings of the Stranglers moving into what I call the scientific era is with the 5-minute single on the B-side, Rocket to the Moon, which, proposes Hugh looking at a future state where, things are going to get worse and worse, eating each other, I fear, by 88, the impending apocalypse. That was hinted at on Straighten Out, about the government capitulation following. And he envisions somebody observing from above, from a rocket to the moon, looking back at Earth, at what's happening as people and society start to break down into savagery. And this reminds me of the Philip K. Dick novel Dr. Blood Money, or How We Got Along After the Bomb, where a crippled survivor is looking down at Earth from an orbiting spacecraft, looking at what's happening in the post-apocalyptic world that follows the beginning of the story. So that's sort of an indicator of what was to come, and it's obviously full of synthy type noises of the kind you get from a space rock band like Hawkwind. So there's a kind of SF tie in there as well sonically, but you really start to get the true measure of the influence of science fiction and dystopian futures on the Stranglers in black and white. So this is the limited edition from a few years ago, which I just pulled out at random. And looking at black and white, starting with side one, the white side, I don't know about you, but when I bought this when I was a kid, I was not quite 15 when it came out. I used to play the black side first. You think black and white, it'd be side one, because they weren't labelled, of course. Of course, we found out years later it was the white side was supposed to be first. I always thought the Curfew was equally good as an opener as Tank, but of course when you think about it in the logical sense, Enough Time really should close the album. It does make more sense that way. So looking at the first side, really, you know, immediately you have Tank, nice and sleazy. Then you have Outside Tokyo, and I would argue that Outside Tokyo is really, it has elements of science fiction. It's very much like the works of J.G. Ballard. Now, J.G. Ballard was an English science fiction writer who, his work began as pure SF, and he gradually pulled it towards general fiction. And he kind of personally created a thing called the slipstream. The term wasn't coined until years later, where you had a kind of ordinary fiction, but when you read it, it felt like science fiction. It felt like it was set 5 minutes in the future. There'd been tiny tweaks, and you'd have that strange sense of cognitive dissonance of something being not quite right. And that's something that comes across a lot in the feel of black and white, I think. The feeling that, you know, it's uncomfortable. Jim Morrison of The Doors said that when he was asked to sum up their music, he said it's a feeling of somebody not quite being at home. And I think you get that very much in black and white. You know, it's sort of harsh and brittle at the same time. So Outside Tokyo, you know, obviously it's about making watches. And there's the lyric that says, if they should ever sell out, that would be the end of time. And one of Ballard's conceits was about time, and about time breaking down and history stopping. And there was a concept in new wave science fiction, which was the thing that Ballard spearheaded in the 60s and 70s, which was about making science fiction more like literature and less like pulp crap. And it was very much about the concept of entropy, which is a concept from physics, which sort of states that, I think it's the second or third law of dynamics, that states that all ordered systems tend toward chaos. So you can leave a room tidy, but things will fall off shelves, dust will gather, and over time things will naturally become more chaotic. That's entropy. It's a physical phenomenon. So that's kind of implicit in Outside Tokyo, and you can imagine time grinding to a halt. It's prescient, because what it's saying is that in late capitalism, as capitalism becomes more and more dominant over the earth, and that was sort of deemed to be a thing around about 1990, that we would reach the end of history. And a philosopher and economist called Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, and he said capitalism's triumphed and now things are essentially over. What he hadn't sort of thought about was the resurgence of religious fundamentalism, which of course has brought history back in a big way with 9/11 and what have you. And of course lots of other things have happened as well. So that's a sort of sign of the sort of speculative, forward-looking thing that was coming into the Stranglers songs at that point. And then, of course, we have Hey, Rise of the Robots. And, you know, it related to a specific incident in a Japanese factory where a worker was killed by a robot on a production line. So it wasn't sort of a Terminator thing, but there's an indication of that, because in the narrative of the song, of course, he was singing about the fact that they'll want a union, they'll want a break. You know, robots will start to acquire human characteristics and demand to be recognized as entities of their own. And that's been a major theme in science fiction from the days of Isaac Asimov first writing his first robot stories way back in the 1930s, which he then went back to the 1950s and started writing a series of great novels, with beginning with The Caves of Steel and The Naked Sun, which are fantastic 50s books about robot detectives, which is superb and great fun. And, you know, he sort of writes about that, how it's also labour relations. It's drawing the metaphor that, of course, robot is a Czech word meaning worker. And it's how, you know, people have been reduced to being robots. And I worked on a production line in the early 80s in South Wales. So I related to that even more once I got to that sort of employable age and I was doing that as a job. So the direct mention of robots there, and the word robot, I say, is a Czech word. It's from a play called RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, by two Czech brothers called the Capex. And it's the original use of the word robot. That's what it comes from. So it's actually from Eastern Europe, which is interesting. So they've got that there straight away. Looking at side, the black side, side B, you open immediately with Curfew, which, you know, is extremely dystopian thing, predicting the government falling as men from the steppes, as the Cold War grows hot, but not too hot, not nuclear. There's actually an invasion, and people from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain invade Western Europe. And, you know, it goes into the wonderful chorus, it becomes black and white. Is it true what they say? They turn the day into night, black and white becomes. And it's interesting because this is very much a theme at the time. In 1978 is the sort of year when post-punk happens, and there's a lot of talk about Joy Division and Magazine, and rightly so, both great bands. I think Joy Division are fantastic but overrated. The Stranglers, of course, it's increasingly recognised that Black and White is the first post-punk album, so it comes before those other ones, and it really takes things beyond the immediate street concerns of punk rock. And, you know, Curfew is symptomatic of that. And it reminds you that the Cold War was very much a big thing. At some point, I'm going to do a video soon about the concept of Berlin in the songs of the 1970s and how the Cold War impacted all sorts of bands, not just sort of punk rock, new wave bands, but even heavy metal bands. It's quite interesting stuff. So that's to come. But yeah, so it sort of shows JJ's worries about an impending collapse of Western Europe and a Soviet invasion, which is a dystopian situation. Of course, it never happens. It remains a science fiction concept. And then, of course, we have Enough Time. And it's interesting because Black and White is when a lot of the literary influences become more overt, because, of course, there's Yukio about Yukio Mishima, and there's Toiler on the Sea from the Victor Hugo novel. So we are seeing more and more of the literary references to the band coming out. And Enough Time, of course, again is concerned with entropy, with things running down, and of course literally the track does run down and slow and grind to a halt. And then of course there's the famous Morse code message on the synth which Dave plays, which older sort of fans will remember that, you know, there was a competition in Strangled, wasn't it, to sort of translate it, because nobody knew what it meant, and of course somebody managed to work it out with the dots and the dashes, and of course it said, hello, this is planet Earth, we are effed, please advise. So it's a message sent from Earth, hopefully to extraterrestrial ears, maybe the Men in Black or the aliens who were behind the Men in Black, as we would discover a year or two later when that album came out. So there are some, you know, overt science fiction messages in there, some dystopian messages particularly. And it's worth remembering that the word dystopian wasn't used very much until quite recently, and it was generally used by critics and historians of science fiction. It wasn't something in common usage, and it's a very common thing in publishing now for people to say it's a dystopian novel, but they forget that the background condition of the stories of most science fiction novels, a good 70-80% of them or more, is dystopian, because if you have a grim, harsh world as a backdrop, it's instantly great for creating drama, for creating stories around. So the fundamental background condition of most science fiction is dystopian, so it is by definition. So, you know, it's a dystopian concept, is a science fiction concept, and, you know, Black and White is a pretty dystopian album, it has to be said. This sort of tendency intensified to a degree with The Raven, and again I've pulled a copy at random, and this is the old 3D one, which you know, you'll know and love. 20,000 copies, signed on the back there by Dave and Hugh, and inside I think it's signed by the others on the inner sleeve. Let me just have a quick look. Did I ever get them to sign it? I've got a feeling I didn't get the others to sign it, so it's not. So it's just signed by Dave and Hugh. I don't know how that happened, but, you know, it was at a very exciting moment in 1979. So there they are with the long ships. And of course, say their vision goes outward across the world and also across time. And looking at the cultures, there's ancient and modern sort of mixed in there. And the two things which come up particularly straight away are Men in Black and genetics. But of course, in Dead Los Angeles, there's that reference to android Americans living in the ruins of Dead Los Angeles. And that's kind of precise, because this is 79. And of course, in 1981, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner came out, and that was set in 2019, and that date has passed now. And of course, I think most people will have seen Blade Runner, because of course there's a connection to Time to Die, where the soliloquy that Rutger Hauer delivers at the end of the film is rewritten into sort of different words, but the same meter, and it's obviously based on that. So, as I say, Hugh Corman was a Philip K. Dick fan. Philip K. Dick wrote the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was then filmed as Blade Runner. And because in Blade Runner is set in Los Angeles, and there's a part where, of course, Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, goes into a large building which is full of water, where J.F. Sebastian, the genetic engineer lives, and he has the androids there. And basically, you know, android Americans live in the ruins there. It's just kind of prescient of that, which is really interesting. And you get this with the Stranglers. There's this weird thing going on where little kernels of ideas are present, and they're subconscious and not conscious at all, and then they turn into albums of songs, which is just fascinating. You know, it's one of the many fascinating things about them. Another reason why they're the greatest rock and roll band ever, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure for you as well. So that's there. But then going towards the end of the album, and you get Men in Black, which obviously is a teaser for what would come. And I can remember seeing the band live in '79 with a vocoder, and they played Men in Black live. You know, it's very, very spooky. And for those of us who were interested in ufology as kids, which I had been, I'd read quite a few things, I knew about the Men in Black. And it was pretty spooky stuff, you know, and the idea that they would come and eat us and what have you. So classic sort of sci-fi concept, but also something that, you know, could have been real, you know. So that's the interesting thing about the whole Men in Black thing. Unidentified flying objects still unidentified. That's the fact. And then genetics. And of course, we know Hugh was a biochemist. He understood biology. And, you know, he talked about messing around and playing God. And of course, you know, in the years since, we've seen genetically modified crops. There was a thing on the Red Button on BBC the other day saying about how, you know, if they're going to sort of breed mice for lab experiments, apparently they only use one sex. I'm not sure whether they use the males or the females, but so half of them are born male, obviously half are born female, and they are just killed and thrown away. You know, they're not even used in the research. And of course, there's the thing is the research, is it right to tamper with genes? And, you know, and it's a dangerous thing, and I guess we're going to see some of the implications of that as time goes on, you know. So again, a classic science fiction concept, but again, the Stranglers generally worked with near future things that could possibly happen. And it's interesting when you look at these albums from what I call the scientific era, as I said, to see how many of these things have borne fruit, you know, from Sha Sha Go Go, to see what we've seen, you know, in Iran since then. Nuclear Device, where luckily, you know, we didn't see too much of that right-wing stuff in Australia. There was a bit of it, and a friend of mine who's an Australian punk rocker, he experienced that. And of course, you know, a lot of the sort of bleakness and grimness of Black and White and the Raven we actually saw in the early 80s with the Thatcher years. So that's my thoughts initially about the subtle but nonetheless very present science fiction influences in the Stranglers' work in that period. I hope to be doing another Stranglers clip between now and the new year. Thanks to everybody in the community for the support, and to the family in black as ever out there. Thanks for all your comments, both positive and negative, both agreeing, disagreeing. I'm very, very happy to always get them and see what you think, because we're not all the same. I think there's a tendency to think that all of us in the Stranglers fan community are the same, that we're all completely rabid and that we all have the same ideas, and that's not true at all. And the diversity of our ideas and opinions has always been really interesting to me. You know, we share common love, and that's the music of the band. But the music makes you think, it makes you talk, makes you discuss, and that's why it's such good music. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now.